Here, on the morning of the 8th of October 1952, it was a very normal morning. Commuters were making their way to work. It was a little bit cold, a little bit misty, but nothing out of the ordinary. Then, within the space of 1 minute, everything changed. 3 trains became caught up in one of British Rail's worst ever disasters. This is the Harrow and Wealdstone train crash. October the 8th, 1952. It's not long after 8 o'clock in the morning, rush hour, and the Harrow and Wealdstone railway station is understandably incredibly busy. The platforms are filling up with commuters who are getting ready to head into London for their day's work. Visibility on this, let's say, typical October morning in London is pretty poor. There's a low lingering fog hanging over the station, which is a big enough problem that it is affecting visibility somewhat, but it's not necessarily unusual conditions for this time of year. And we actually still have the Met Office report into the weather conditions in this area on that day, in which it points out that dense fog was affecting parts of southern England, most notably across parts of northwest London. So visibility wasn't great, but not necessarily bad enough to be the sole reason for what was about to take place, which we'll touch on in a little bit. Now, the West Coast Main Line here at Harrow and Wealdstone is a fast-moving, complex and heavily used area. And obviously, being there to make this video, I can tell you that things haven't really changed that much. Coming through this one station, you have local stopping trains at certain platforms, coming in reasonably slowly to come to a halt at platforms and pick up commuters. Then, at the time, you have these long-distance overnight express trains that are coming from way up north all the way down to London, and all of this across 6 tracks. So, although separated by platforms, you've got slow trains and incredibly high-speed trains all coming through here at the same time. And back in 1952, for years and years and years, this had worked fine. But on this particular October morning, 3 trains were about to converge on this station in a way that would be remembered for decades to come. So let's start with train number 1, the 7:31 up local passenger train from Tring to Euston, which comprised of 9 non-corridor bogie coaches hauled by a 264 type tank engine. Also, just a quick reminder that I'm not a train person, so if I make any mistakes here or any minor errors, do let me know in the comments. I'm trying my best here, and I would love to be a full-time train person, but I just don't have the stones to commit to that lifestyle, much to the never-ending disappointment of my father. This local Tring to Euston train had crossed from the up slow to the up fast line at what is described as the country end of the station, and had stopped there, as it was booked to, at platform number 4. It had been standing there for about 1.5 minutes, nothing crazy, and the brakes had just been released in preparation to pull away when something happened. Now, annoyingly, they're actually working on these 2 platforms here. So I can't actually get over there, which is annoying because that's where this happened. But I can stand on this side of the fence. I mean, in a way, it feels like it's right that this section of the track should be closed off today because, you know, in a way it's in memorial to what happened here. It's not, they're just doing some work to it. I don't know, it feels oddly fitting that I came here today. If somewhat annoying. The crowded local train from Tring to Euston had stopped just here behind me on the other side of the fence. A Keith Cheney, who was 18 at the time and was on the local train, had just got onto the front coach with a friend because apparently the carriages at the back were completely full, and he described hearing the following.
There was a terrific bang at the back of the train just after the train was ready to leave. We walked down the platform. There was smoke and steam everywhere and you couldn't see what was going on.
Which brings us to train number 2, the Perth to Euston Express. This train consisted of 11 bogie vehicles, including 4 sleeping cars and 3 vans, and it was being hauled by a tender engine of the 462 type. This train is approaching the station at speed, travelling at around 50 to 60 miles per hour, and it's not slowing down. At approximately 8:18, 8:19 in the morning, the Perth train, which was heading at speed from that direction there behind me, crossed over into the same track that the local commuter was sitting in here. And that bang that Keith Cheney describes experiencing at the front of the local train was the Perth to Euston Express ploughing straight into the back of his train. Right about where I'm standing here, so just down from the bridge there, is where the Perth train hit the commuter train. You'd be right for thinking, well, that seems bizarre. Why was the Perth to Euston Express travelling that fast on the same line as the stopped local train? Surely that shouldn't happen. And you'd be correct. Allowing for no external human error or following all of the systems and regulations at the time, this shouldn't have happened. Coming into Harrow and Wealdstone, the Perth Express would have passed a colour light distance signal at caution, followed by 2 semaphore signals at danger. And even if you're not 100% familiar with the 1950s signal system in North London, let me tell you, I'm not really that familiar with it. I think you can probably suss out that both that caution signal and the following 2 danger signals were telling the driver exactly what he should be doing, that being slowing down and stopping. Again, the Perth train and its driver did neither of these things. In fact, the official investigation found that the train passed both the caution signal and the 2 danger signals without slowing down at all. It was found that the brakes on the Perth train had been applied at the very last moment. But if you know anything about trains and you know anything about just large things trying to come to a stop, pulling the brake doesn't just stop you there and then. And so applying the brakes at the very last second would have made absolutely no difference to the train's speed. At approximately 8:19 a.m, just as the local train is prepping to pull out, the express train slams into the rear of the stationary train, and the effect is immediate and absolutely catastrophic. Seeing the speed at which some of the trains are coming through here today just makes you shudder at the idea of this Perth Express just slamming at almost those speeds into the back of the local train. Describing this as a crash seems to somewhat downplay the severity of what happened. The engine of the Perth train struck the rear of the local train around the top of the platform ramp, and within seconds had telescoped the last 3 coaches of the local train into about the length of little more than 1, whilst also shunting the entire train forward by about 20 yards. If you are fortunate enough to not know what telescoping means when we're talking about a train crash, it is essentially where one coach is forced through another. And in older, usually wooden-bodied stock like these trains, they offered very little resistance to sudden, extreme compression. It's hard not to think at this point of Keith Cheney describing those rear carriages on the local train being completely full with passengers. Now you look at some of these modern trains like this one behind me here, and you're like, well, they go a lot faster than trains did in the 1950s, so an accident today would be so much more deadly. Well, you know, it depends on a lot of factors, but actually I think what people tend to forget is these trains, despite travelling a bit slower than a lot of modern trains, were made of much weaker material. In fact, at this point, a lot of carriages on certain steam trains would have been made of just very, very lightweight wood, with a solid steel metal, undercarriage. And so any crash at any speed was likely to result in, almost complete destruction of the carriages. Even the solid metal sections of these carriages did not fare well. The bogies and underframes of these carriages were essentially crumpled together on impact, with the 3 completely distorted underframes being flung aside to the left, coming to rest in what the report describes as an irregular heap on the up-fast platform. When we take a closer look at the wooden bodies of the 2 rear coaches, they were of course completely shattered as they were telescoped together. And the report actually remarkably explains that some passengers in those 2 rear coaches actually escaped with comparatively slight injuries considering the circumstances they found themselves in. The brake compartment at the trailing end of the third to last coach and the 2 passenger compartments that were next to it were completely demolished. But the remaining passenger compartments on this coach managed to stay relatively together. But the body of this coach was torn from its underframe and overturned onto its left onto the platform. The leading end of this coach finally came to a rest beneath the station footbridge and alongside the Perth train's engine. Fortunately, apart from the 2 rear compartments of the following coach ahead, the 6 further coaches on the local train sustained no severe structural damage, meaning they were able to be pulled forward out of the wreckage by the undamaged tank engine. The engine of the Perth train had actually derailed to the right onto the down fast line and actually come to a rest more or less upright. However, the tender had overturned to the left and crushed the left-hand side of the engine cab. After the impact, it had travelled a further 78 yards before coming to a stop, incredibly close to the 6th coach on the local train. Looking back at the coaches of that Perth Express, the sudden impact of the heavy engine at the front into the local train had caused the leading 2 vans behind and the following 3 passenger coaches to immediately pile up behind and above it. And the distorted underframes and bogies, along with some of those bogies from the local trains, were found to have been compressed into a massive wreckage about 100 feet long and were scattered across the up and down fast lines in between the platforms. And the bodies of these carriages were completely destroyed, leaving nothing even really recognisable as a train carriage. The carriages behind these first few on the express train remained relatively undamaged. Just a few internal fittings were displaced. But the damage to those front few carriages was incredible. Where I'm standing now on platform 6, I would have actually been quite safe because the Perth train was travelling on the line just on the other side of the fence over there. And when you look at the report and the diagram of the crash site and where the debris ended up, most of the line on this side actually remained kind of relatively okay. Some debris got thrown over, but most of the damage was right in the middle over there. Now, if the first crash hadn't been bad enough, what followed is what made this one of the worst rail disasters in British history. Before anybody can react, before even the dust can settle, a 3rd train arrived. This was the 8 a.m. Down Express from Euston to Liverpool and Manchester. It consisted of 15 bogie vehicles, including 4 vans at the rear. And this train was apparently double-headed with a 460 type engine in front and a 462 type engine attached to the coaches. This northbound express was travelling on the down fast lane, the track adjacent to the up fast line on which the local train had been sitting. And during the first collision, an incredible amount of debris, along with the engine of the Perth train, had fallen on to this down fast line. and with the Liverpool Express travelling at what is described as not much less than 60 miles per hour, the driver had almost no time to react. The Liverpool and Manchester Express came flying through with no way to avoid what was now in front of it. The leading engine of the Liverpool train struck the derailed engine of the Perth train, only a second or two after the first collision had taken place. In fact, it's probably the Liverpool train that had stopped the Perth train from travelling even further down the line, as they both smashed into each other in a head-on collision. This crash stopped the Perth engine in its tracks, but both of the Liverpool train engines were immediately forced off to the left across one of the platforms and overturned, fouling the up electric line. Now, fortunately, the current from this electric line was immediately removed by the resulting short circuit, which meant that an approaching up electric train from Watford managed to stop well clear just from the loss of current in the tracks, and also by the upline home signal immediately being changed to danger. According to the report, apart from its boiler, the leading engine of the Liverpool train was, in the report's words, practically reduced to scrap. The bogie was completely wrecked and its component parts scattered across the tracks and platforms. It was also incredibly badly damaged at the rear end as the tender was driven into it on impact. There was also severe damage to the engine attached to the carriages behind it, but the damage to this engine was nowhere near as severe as the two which had taken the brunt of the impact. The first passenger coach on the Liverpool train was destroyed. The third coach was also destroyed, with its wreckage ending up on the downfast platform. The fourth carriage actually rode diagonally across the wreckage of the Perth train, causing further damage to both, and finally came to rest on the up-fast platform. Now, the coaches on this train were all steel, and so the damage was not quite as complete as it was in the wooden trains. But for this fourth carriage, the greater part of its roof at the rear had been completely torn away as it was forced up and against the girders beneath the footbridge. Here, the carriages hadn't completely disintegrated, but they had crumpled severely. The fifth coach was demolished, with the following two, the sixth and seventh coaches, being carried beyond it and mounting the engine of the Perth train and the other wreckage around it. Again, these carriages kept their shape better, being all steel coaches, but they still suffered an incredible amount of damage. The seventh coach actually ended up lying directly on the buried engine of the Perth train, and its roof was about 30 feet above the level of the rails. From what I've seen, I'm not sure if anyone was standing up here when the train crashed, but if they had been, they would have been in for a nasty surprise. The following coach was the kitchen car, and this coach ended up travelling across the wreckage that was already in front of it and wound up wedged under the footbridge. And incredibly fortunately here, this being the kitchen car, it required gas to help with the cooking. But fortunately, the various gas reservoirs were broken on impact and all the gas was released, and so there was no fire. The remaining 7 vehicles behind the kitchen car suffered no serious structural damage. And finally, the 3 trains had come to a stop. It's incredibly hard to picture that bridge crossing the tracks over there behind me as it was after the crash took place, just with a huge pile of wreckage beneath it and some embedded in it. The report describes the damage done to the 3 express engines and the rolling stock as altogether exceptional. It points out how 3 passenger coaches from the local train, 3 from the Perth train, and 7 from the Liverpool train, as well as 2 bogie vans and a kitchen car, were either completely demolished or at the very least incredibly heavily damaged. It points out how 13 of those 16 vehicles described were compressed into a heap of wreckage that was only about 45 yards long, 18 yards wide, and 30 feet high. You've got to remember that that compressed section of wrecked metal and wood had been full of people. The crash had taken place in a matter of seconds. As awful as the picture of what happened here is, what happened afterwards is actually quite uplifting. As much as this was a scene of horrible chaos and disaster, what began to grow on the platform afterwards was incredible. The rescue effort began almost as quickly. Telephone calls from those on the scene went out almost at once, and railway staff, uninjured passengers, police, fire brigades, nurses, doctors, and local volunteers all converged on the station within minutes. In fact, the first ambulance and doctor arrived within 3 minutes, and apparently the first loaded ambulance left the scene at 8:27, only 8 minutes after the crash had taken place. It's also noted that there was incredibly valuable help provided by a United States Air Force medical unit who were actually on the local train. And one of those, a Lieutenant Abby Sweetwine, became known as the Angel of Platform 6. She worked tirelessly on the platform, organising the triage, and apparently used a tube of lipstick to mark an X on the forehead of anyone who'd already been treated, and an M for anyone who'd already been given morphine. And a lot of people are of the opinion that it was her swift thinking and action that prevented a lot more death. At the same time as these incredible efforts were happening to rescue anyone who could be, Harrow Cottage Hospital at Roxeth Hill nearby was rapidly clearing beds and laying mattresses on the floors to cope with the sudden flood of casualties from this awful crash. What's incredible as well is that this could have been so much worse if it weren't for the exact time that it took place. Because travelling on one of the trains were railway staff heading to work at the London Midland offices in Euston, and those that weren't immediately injured were able to hop out and start the rescue efforts almost immediately. The report also notes that a gentleman called Mr. L. Rowlands of the Operating Superintendent's Department of Euston was pivotal in organising these rescue efforts. This despite having been on the 4th coach of the local train. As well as helping to organise the first aid and rescue efforts, he also made sure that all other railway departments had been advised of the accident as soon as they could. From about 8:23 a.m, so only 4 minutes after the crash, ambulances, doctors, nurses, fire brigade, police continued to arrive. The few small fires were put out, and then all efforts went to removing the injured from the wreckage. As we've seen as well in other crashes of the period like this, a lot of offers of assistance were accepted from local residents. One of those being a 14-year-old scout called Gilbert Powell. He had just hopped on a bus to head to school when he heard what he described as a great big smash, at which point he apparently immediately ran to the platform and came face to face with the carnage. In an article in 2012, he explained some of the harrowing things that he saw. But despite only being 14, because of his small frame, he was immediately utilised as somebody who could crawl into the wreckage to try and locate survivors.
People from the fire brigade couldn't get under the railway carriage because it was a massive great pile, and they allowed me down underneath to see if anybody was alive down under there. I shouted out to them, "There's one there, there are 2 over there," and they came and removed the rubble.
In the same BBC article, he goes on to explain how he went home and was basically told off for being late for school and for nobody knowing where he was, so he didn't necessarily get his plaudits immediately. But later on, when one of his scout leaders came and explained what he'd done, they told him not to be too big-headed about it. But clearly the accident had a huge impact on him, as he still vividly recalls some of the wounded and dead that he saw at the scene. Needless to say, it's thought that he was probably the youngest person to help, and it's probable that he helped save a lot of people. Although let's just hope that in this day and age, we don't need to be sending 14-year-olds into train wreckage anymore. By 12:15 p.m, it seemed that the vast majority of the injured had received first aid attention and or been conveyed to hospital. There were 2 people seriously injured removed later in the day at 2:30 p.m, but it wasn't until around 1:30 a.m. the following morning that it was determined that there was no chance of anyone else being found alive. The casualty list was, of course, awful. In fact, the number of dead and injured had only once exceeded this accident in the Quintins Hill crash in 1915. Unfortunately, despite the best efforts of everybody who was here on the scene and those in hospital later on, 112 people died. It was determined that 98 passengers and 4 railway staff who were on duty were killed outright at the moment of impact. This included the driver and the fireman of the Perth Express and the driver of the leading engine of the Liverpool Express. 10 passengers later died in hospital from their injuries. The investigation into where the different fatalities occurred in which trains proved difficult, as everything had basically been smashed into that tiny little area. But there was enough evidence found to determine that 64 of the casualties came from the local train in those rear few carriages. 23 were in the Perth train, and only 7 casualties were in the Liverpool train, showing the difference between the older wooden stock and these new all-steel carriages. It could not be determined where the remaining 14 casualties had been at the time of the accident, but the report says that it is probable that most of them were on the platforms and struck by the derailed trains when the crash occurred. And of those passengers who were killed, 36 were members of railway staff who were travelling to work in London, with most of them working at the London Midland Region offices in Euston. Another 157 people were so badly injured that they needed to be taken to hospital, and of course many people were left with severe disabilities, even if they did survive the crash. 84 of those were passengers who had incredibly serious injuries. 4 railway staff from the trains were also kept in hospital, and they included the fireman of the leading engine of the Liverpool train and the driver and fireman of the second engine, who had somehow managed to make incredible escapes as their engines were overturned. And a further 183 people suffered either minor injury or shock. And that's not taking into account, of course, the many people who were probably traumatized in the rescue attempts after the fact, which, as we saw with the Lewisham crash, is something that can't be written off in disasters like this. The amount of second, third-hand trauma from people who weren't necessarily directly involved but witnessed the aftermath can have a profoundly devastating effect on people's lives. Incredibly, we still have access to the various lists that were made naming the known fatalities and those injured who went to various hospitals and mortuaries. These papers were apparently almost lost when they were found in a skip by an Inspector Bill Hay when the old Euston division of the London Midland region closed in the late 1980s. And fortunately they were saved, and so we now still have here the written names and addresses of the unfortunate victims of this disaster. It's interesting, it really makes it hit home all the more just seeing these people's names written on paper in front of us like this. What's incredible as well is that the cleanup operation for this was just ludicrously fast. In fact, the station was back up and running within 21 hours of the crash taking place. I think there was certainly something to be said for this happening after the Second World War and people being very, very used still to having to get things back up and running very, very quickly. When you look at examples, other examples that we covered on the channel, like the Lewisham train crash, again, they were able to get the bridge over the railway there up and running really, really fast. So credit where credit's due. Credit where credit's due, despite this awful, awful worst case scenario disaster taking place. In the big scheme of things, it barely made a dent on the actual train schedule here. So, what happened? The official investigation leading to the official report was very, very careful and methodical in going through every step that could have gone wrong to lead to this awful event. After thorough investigation of the signalling in the area, it was found that there had been no failure. The signals had been showing the correct caution and danger signs. With the signals working correctly, the Perth Express had approached that distance signal at caution, failed to reduce speed, and then passed 2 further danger signals that were there to protect the occupied line. The weather conditions were then taken into account. As we've seen already, there was patchy fog in the area that wasn't necessarily unusual or exceptional. Remember, this was London at the peak of its deadly smog, so it didn't seem to be bad enough to excuse what had happened. And so attention fell back on the driver of the Perth train, and the either ignoring of or simply missing of these signals. In fact, the report goes out of its way to write that the safety of railway traffic must depend at all times on the obedience to signals. But also went on to point out that no reasonable arrangement of the existing set of safety rules could do anything to prevent this sort of human error. The signalman responsible for the signals around the station was also exonerated from blame, there being some question about whether he changed the signals at the last moment, but this was found not to be the case, and so blame fell back on driver Jones of the Perth train. The report does go on to mention the regrettable death of both driver Jones and his fireman on the Perth Express. Jones had considerable experience and a very good record. Witness statements also pointed out that he'd been driving well on the day, and seemed to have proper alertness and had stopped at prior signals, with visibility also being confirmed as being not great, but not as bad as it could be. The report deemed it reasonable to assume that he had known where he was at the time, and should have known the route from experience, meaning of course that he should know the signals he was looking for. It was also pointed out that 2 other drivers travelling just before had seen the signals well enough. Incapacitation by a sudden illness was also ruled out, with a doctor's report pointing out that no examination had pointed out any kind of defect that might have distracted his attention. And so ultimately the report, somewhat inconclusively, concludes that the most likely reason for this taking place was a simple laxing of concentration on the part of driver Jones, meaning that he missed these signals and never slowed down in time. Now, this conclusion, more or less pointing out that the only cause of this crash was human error, was clearly a bit of a shock to British Railway. And this is where the Harrow and Wealdstone crash was incredibly important in changing British Railway safety for the better. The author of the report, Lieutenant Colonel G.R.S. Wilson, made the case strongly for some kind of automatic warning equipment that could provide a direct link between the signal and the cab, hence completely removing the possibility of a train driver missing a signal. In the report, he pointed to decades of older accident data and argued that warning-type automatic train control could have prevented, or at the very least mitigated, some of these accidents, including all of the 112 lives lost here at Harrow and Wealdstone. And this disaster became one of the strongest catalysts for wider adoption and installation of automatic warning systems on Britain's main lines. Unfortunately, as we know if you've seen other videos on my channel, in certain places it was going to take a few more unfortunate, devastating accidents for these systems to be installed everywhere. This, as always, is another example of safety rules being written in blood. This, along with a number of other crashes, including crashes like the Lewisham crash, were apparently what needed to happen for automatic safety features to be brought in on trains. So the only real silver lining to this is that things got safer because of it. And really, we should never see a crash as bad as this one again in Britain. And in 2002, a plaque memorialising the disaster was installed outside the main entrance to the station, in memory of the 112 people who lost their lives at Harrow and Wealdstone on October the 8th, 1952. What's also really nice is that up on the bridge here is this amazing mural which shows a timeline of the local area, and included on it is a little memorial to the train crash here. As always, thank you for watching. This is obviously a devastating tragedy amongst too many devastating rail tragedies in this country. But fortunately, one as bad as this hasn't happened for a very long time. If you found the video interesting, leave a comment suggesting anything else you'd like me to cover, and subscribe to the channel if you want to see more like this, and as always, I'll see you in the next one.